I stood in the small kitchen of our vacation home, the soft amber glow of the light casting warm shadows on the wooden walls around me. Despite the cozy setting, the air felt stifling heavy. With an unspoken tension, my breath quickened and my heart thudded loudly, as though it was trying to break free from my chest. In front of me stood Aaron, the young handyman, wiping beads of sweat from his forehead after finishing the repair on the kitchen sink. His faded t-shirt clung teally to his body, outlining his toned muscles, a detail I couldn't help but notice. I had no idea how things had escalated to this point. Our eyes met, a fleeting glance that seemed accidental but carried a charged intensity. Neither of us could deny the awkward silence between us was palpable, yet it wasn't enough to mask the quiet energy crackling in the space we shared. Aaron took a small step back, as though trying to break the heavy silence. "I'm all done," he said, his voice horror yet soft. "Just need to double-check it one more time." To be sure, I nodded but said nothing. I couldn't believe what I was doing. My mind was blank, filled only with an indescribable sensation, something magnetic and dangerous pulling me closer to him. I stepped toward him, reducing the distance between us until only a breath separated us. "Aaron," I murmured, my voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, or if I should say anything at all. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hesitation and conflict. "Julia," he said, my name slipping from his lips like both a warning and an invitation, and then neither of us spoke another word. In that moment I stopped thinking about everything: Mark, my loving husband, this serene little house that was supposed to be a sanctuary, or any consequences at all. All that mattered was the overwhelming wave of emotion crashing over me. I leaned in, feeling Aaron's breath so close it sent shivers sing through me. Our lips met in a kiss that was both impulsive and desperate. I felt the struggle in the way he kissed me back, his hand gently resting on my arm, as if torn between pulling me closer and pushing me away. My heart raced wildly, caught in the paradox of doing what felt simultaneously right and wrong, perfect and utterly reckless all at once. But after just a few seconds, Aaron pulled back abruptly. He stepped away, his face a storm of pain and confusion. "We can't do this," he said, his voice trembling. I can't." I stood frozen, feeling as though I'd just been jolted awake from a dream. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I didn't even know who I was apologizing to, Aaron, Mark, or myself. Aaron stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with emotions I couldn't decipher. Then, without another word, he turned and hurried out of the kitchen. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the silence, marking the end of a moment that should never have existed. I remained there, enveloped in the oppressive quiet, my mind swirling with guilt and disorientation, but beneath the weight of those feelings there was something else, a flicker of an emotion I couldn't ignore. It was raw, intense, and dangerously thrilling. I knew from that moment on nothing would ever be the same. Aaron left, leaving me standing alone in the quiet kitchen. I couldn't think of anything else but the question echoing in my mind: what had I done? How had I let things spiral so far out of control? Yet perhaps the answer didn't lie in this moment, but somewhere in the past, where small, seemingly insignificant pieces had gradually led me to this point. A few years ago, when I married Mark, I truly believed I was the luckiest woman alive. Mark was the perfect man by any standard: mature, successful, and endlessly kind. He treated me with respect and love, and our life together seemed flawless. We had a cozy house in the suburbs, steady jobs, and grand plans for the future. But sometimes a picture-perfect life can conceal cracks that only those living it can truly feel. At first, I didn't notice the growing distance between Mark and me. He was always busy with work, and I tried to convince myself that it was normal. He often came home late, exhausted and drained, sometimes too tired to talk about even the simplest things. The rare evenings we spent together gradually turned into rushed, superficial conversations, and then eventually silence. But I loved him, and I thought that if I just waited patiently, things would get better. When Mark bought the vacation home, I hoped it would be a chance to repair our relationship. I envisioned evenings spent cooking together, sitting outside watching the sunset, and enjoying peaceful moments that would bring us closer. But reality fell far short of those dreams. The house quickly became a place where I spent more time alone than with Mark. Despite his good intentions, he was often too consumed by work, frequently returning to the city to handle urgent projects. In that solitude, I began to feel the emptiness within me. I didn't hate Mark, I couldn't even blame him, but the coldness and lack of connection left me feeling trapped in my own life, like a swimmer in still water with no destination in sight. And then Aaron arrived. Aaron had been hired to repair the roof after a heavy storm. He was young, energetic, and carried himself with an effortless charm that put me at ease from the first moment we met. At the beginning, I didn't think much of him beyond being a diligent and kind worker, but as the days went by and I saw more of Aaron, I realized that a part of me, a part that had been dormant for so long, was beginning to awaken. I remember the first time Aaron smiled at me, a fleeting but genuine smile. It wasn't like the perfunctory nods I'd grown accustomed to receiving from Mark. Aaron noticed the little things about me: the kind of tea I preferred, the way I tied my hair when the weather was warm, our brief conversations about the weather. His work became the moments I looked forward to most each day. I told myself that these feelings were harmless, nothing more than a fleeting spark of excitement, a little light in the monotony of life, but gradually I began finding excuses to talk to Aaron more often, a leaky foray, here a sticky door, there any reason to keep him around longer, and each time I felt myself inching closer to a line I knew I shouldn't cross. Aaron, while he never said it outright, wasn't entirely oblivious to the situation. There were moments when his gaze lingered on me just a little too long, times when he answered my questions with a smile that stayed with me long after he had left, but both of us stayed silent, as if the silence could somehow hold back the inevitable look. Looking back at those early days with Aaron fills me with both warmth and regret. Perhaps if I hadn't felt so lonely, things would have been different. Perhaps if Mark had noticed me more, I wouldn't have noticed the way Aaron smiled. But what's done is done, and now I'm left to face the consequences of my actions, consequences I'm not sure I'm strong enough to endure. I stared out the kitchen window, watching as the sunlight faded, giving way to the encroaching darkness. The shadow filled the room, mirroring the hollow feeling growing inside me. Memories of the past didn't bring comfort. They only made the fragility of my present reality more apparent. I didn't know what I was searching for, but one thing was certain: the peace I once knew had been lost long ago. I can still clearly remember that afternoon when Aaron first arrived to fix the severely damaged roof after a heavy storm. Mark had called him through a local repair service, unwilling to spend his precious weekend handling the job himself. I stood in the living room watching through the large window as Aaron appeared. His tall, youthful frame stood out in the afternoon sunlight, a large tool bag slung confidently over his shoulder. At that moment, I didn't think much about him. He was just a skilled handyman we were fortunate to find. In the days that followed, Aaron's presence gradually became a familiar part of life at the vacation house. He arrived each morning with a friendly smile and a surprising level of enthusiasm. At first I kept my distance, maintaining the role of a polite homeowner, offering tea and asking a few perfunctory questions about his work, but there was something about his easygoing nature and lighthearted demeanor that made me feel at ease, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Aaron worked with intense focus, yet there were moments of warmth that softened his seriousness. One time, as I brought him a glass of water, he looked up from the ladder, squinting into the sunlight with a playful smile. "You're too kind to bring this, I should have done it myself," he said, his deep voice resonating warmly. I smiled back, but I couldn't ignore the way his words, simple as they were, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Our conversations grew more frequent as the days went by. I asked him about his family, other jobs he worked on, and occasionally about mundane little things in life. Aaron, in turn, showed a quiet curiosity about me, though he always maintained a respectful distance. He never pried too deeply about Mark, only offering a knowing smile whenever I mentioned my husband, but in his eyes I saw something more, a kind of genuine attentiveness that I no longer felt from Mark. Then there was the day when Aaron was repairing the window frame in the backyard. I walked out with 2 steaming cups of coffee and sat down on the bench nearby watching him work. He wore a thin, faded t-shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal his toned arms. My cheeks burned, and I forced myself not to stare for too long. But when he turned and caught my gaze, his smile felt disarming, almost melting the walls. I tried to keep up. "Thank you," he said, taking the coffee from my hands. I really needed a break. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward. It was a comfortable stillness, as if both of us knew there was no need for words. Then he spoke, his tone calm and genuine. "Do you spend much time here? This house is beautiful." I shook my head, smiling faintly. "Not really. Mark bought it hoping we'd spend more time together, but he's always so busy." I didn't know why I admitted that, but as the words slipped out, I realized my voice carried a sadness I hadn't intended to show. Aaron didn't say anything, but his eyes told me he understood. He didn't push for more, only nodding quietly. Yet from that moment something subtle and unspoken formed between us, a connection that neither of us could deny, but both knew we shouldn't acknowledge. As time went on, I found myself looking forward to Aaron's presence each day. I started coming up with excuses to keep him around longer, asking about trivial details of the work or requesting help with minor issues that didn't really need fixing. Deep down I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. And then came that evening, the evening when everything spiraled out of control. Mark had to return to the city for an urgent meeting, leaving me alone in the vacation house. I remember how the emptiness felt unbearable, as if the silence of the house was pressing in on me, amplifying my loneliness. I called Aaron, asking him to come by and check the kitchen sink. I knew it was just an excuse, but at that moment I didn't care. When he arrived with his usual friendly smile, I felt a fleeting sense of warmth that momentarily replaced the ache in my chest. He worked as I stood nearby quietly watching him. When he finished, I invited him to stay for dinner. At first he declined, but after I insisted, he hesitantly agreed. Dinner started off light and easy, but beneath the surface an undeniable tension simmered. Every glance, every smile carried a weight that neither of us acknowledged aloud, but both of us felt deeply. Then, as I stood up to pour more wine, he stepped closer. The distance between us disappeared, and I felt my heart pounding so hard it was almost audible. When I turned back around, our eyes met, and The world seemed to stand still in that moment. I knew. Every boundary had been erased. I don't remember who moved first, but when our lips met I knew I had crossed a line I could never uncross. The kiss was filled with both longing and conflict, and I felt his hesitation mirrored in my own, yet in that moment neither of us could stop. When it was over we stood in silence. Aaron looked at me, his eyes heavy with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and trembling. Then he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me alone with the chaos swirling in my mind. That night I sat in the dark, unable to sleep. I hadn't just lost my sense of self-worth, I had lost something even more precious, the peace I had worked so hard to preserve within myself. Since that fateful night, the atmosphere between Aaron and me was never the same. In the days that followed I tried to act as if everything was normal, desperately concealing the chaos roaring within me. I continued waking up early, preparing breakfast and sipping coffee as I always did. Mark returned from his business trip as devoted and cheerful as ever, chatting with me about work and life. But every time I caught a glimpse of Aaron through the window my chest tightened and my heart pounded, as if I were caught in a sin too big to confess. Aaron no longer entered the house with his usual ease when working in the yard. He kept his distance, avoiding casual conversations or lingering glances, but the silence, instead of soothing the tension, cut deeper into my mind like a sharp blade. Every time I walked past where he was working I could feel his eyes briefly on me, never for longer than a second. We never spoke of what had happened, but I knew he was struggling with the same turmoil I was. One afternoon when Mark had stepped out to meet a friend I stayed behind. Aaron was in the backyard fixing something, and I told myself I wouldn't engage him, that the best thing I could do was to let everything fade away as if nothing had ever happened. But that resolve evaporated the moment I saw him through the window, his figure, the weariness on his face mirroring the conflict I was burying deep inside myself. I walked outside with a glass of cold water in hand. Aaron looked up as I approached, his eyes betraying a flicker of hesitation before settling into their usual calm. "Thank you," he said, taking the glass without looking directly at me. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice low but laced with concern. He was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. "I'm fine, it's just things are hard," he finally said. The simplicity of his response tightened something inside me. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened between us, but the words caught in my throat. Aaron looked at me, and for the first time his gaze held mine for longer than a fleeting second. In his eyes I saw pain, struggle, and a sadness that ran deep. "I think I should stop," he said, his voice steady but heavy with finality. "I shouldn't be working here anymore." His words felt like a knife to my heart, but I knew he was right. I didn't respond, only nodded, feeling the emptiness inside me growing larger. But just as I thought everything was about to end, fate intervened once again. The next day heavy rain revealed a leak in the newly repaired roof. Mark, too busy to deal with it himself, called Aaron back. The tension in the air was immediate. When he arrived, thick and suffocating. This time Mark was home, and his presence gave me some semblance of comfort. But when Mark had to step out for a few hours to handle some work, Aaron and I were left alone again, thrust into a space both of us had been trying to avoid. I busied myself in the kitchen washing dishes and focusing on anything to keep my mind from wandering to the man in the adjacent living room. Yet no matter how hard I tried I couldn't ignore the weight of his presence. It was as though the very air between us had grown dense. When I finally walked into the living room, I saw Aaron standing by the couch, staring down at the floor as if grappling with some inner battle. I hesitated, intending to turn back, but before I could he spoke. "Julia," he said, his voice rough and trembling slightly. I stopped, but didn't turn around. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what to do," he said, and words made me turn to face him. Our eyes met, and for the first time neither of us tried to hide what we were feeling. The anguish, the struggle, and the unspoken emotions we both had been suppressing were laid bare in his gaze. I didn't know who moved first, but in a single moment we were close again, and I knew there was no turning back this time. It was the second time we crossed the line, and this time there was no hesitation, no immediate apologies. There was only silence, a quiet acknowledgement that we had stepped into a world where neither of us belonged. When it was over, Aaron said nothing. He left just as he had before, leaving me alone with a storm of emotions swirling inside me. I sat on the couch, staring out the window, feeling the weight of the shift that had taken place between us. I knew I couldn't continue like this, but I also didn't know how to escape the mess we had created. What I felt for Aaron was no longer just a fleeting infatuation, it had become a part of me, and that was what scared me the most. I didn't know what our ending would look like, but I knew one thing for certain: from this point on everything had irrevocably changed.